Welcome to Crimson Clues, the home of thrilling mysteries and shocking twists. Don't forget to subscribe and hit this so you never miss a clue. Now let's start the mystery. The Wisteria House Mystery, Chapter 1, The Wedding Invitation. The strange circumstances that would unfold at Wisteria House during that tragic summer of 1936 began, as so many momentous events do, with what appeared to be the most innocent of social exchanges. Miss Helena Mallory's wedding invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning in June, having all the hallmarks of a traditional society gathering, but destined to land my buddy Poirot and myself in exceptional and sinister circumstances. I'd known the Mallorys for some years, dating back to my military service, when duty would periodically bring me to their Hampshire estate. The invitation itself was lovely in its simplicity, written on the best cream paper with tasteful calligraphy proclaiming Miss Helena's upcoming nuptials to one Mr. Richard Thornton, a name that struck me as somewhat familiar but whose provenance I couldn't immediately pinpoint. A wedding, Hastings? Poirot questioned, noting my bewildered expression as I examined the fine script. My friend had emerged from his bedroom with his usual precision, every part of his look meeting his strict standards, from the flawless symmetry of his mustache to the immaculate placement of his morning clothes. Indeed, Poirot, Miss Helena Mallory. You may recall me mentioning the Mallorys of Wisteria House a few years ago while stationed in Hampshire. I offered him the invitation, watching as his piercing green eyes studied not simply the words, but the paper itself, the quality of the printing, and even the manner in which the envelope had been addressed. "Ah, we have a military connection," he said, his fingers twisting the card with particular care. "If I recall correctly, Nespa, the father, made his wealth in railways." My memory was awakened by his words. Exactly right. Sir James Mallory, a self-made man who bought the estate in the 1890s, was initially shunned by the older county families, but his wealth and Helena's stunning beauty have now cemented their place in local society. I paused to examine the invitation's consequences. I must admit, I was startled to receive this. I haven't spoken with Helena in some years, but I recall hearing rumors in London legal circles about her relationship with a talented young barrister. Poirot raised his eyebrows in inquiry. This would be Mr. Thornton, as specified in the invitation. "Tell me, mon ami, what kind of young lady is Miss Helena Mallory?" I found myself ruminating on my earlier interactions with the Mallory family, notably when duty sent me to their Hampshire estate. "She's a striking woman with dark hair, rather gorgeous, and strong eyes that reveal depths one might not expect. There was always something slightly enigmatic about her, though I attributed that to the usual reserve of a young woman of her status." I hesitated, searching for the right words to express my feelings. She possessed an intelligence that was perhaps more acute than is traditionally feminine, if I may put it that way. Her discourse indicated interests beyond the typical jobs of county society. Poirot found it intriguing, and his tone suggested genuine curiosity. "And you stated the prospective bridegroom's legal circles. Richard Thornton has built a reputation as a barrister, particularly in commercial issues involving foreign trade. I believe he is associated with chambers that do a lot of business in South America, such as Argentina and Brazil. By all accounts, he is a rising star, albeit I have never met him in person." Poirot returned the invitation to me with a serious expression. "The setting, I believe, will be the family home, Wisteria House. Such arrangements are frequently the most instructive, revealing much about family dynamics and social interactions." "You speak as though you were considering attending," I remarked, shocked. My acquaintance was not particularly fond of social gatherings, considering them monotonous unless they presented a specific point of interest. "But of course, Hastings, the invitation applies to both of us, and you have spoken so eloquently about the beauty of the Hampshire countryside in the summer. Furthermore," he continued with the little smirk that frequently accompanied his most accurate observations, "weddings are occasions when people unveil their true personalities. The emotions are high, old ties resurface, and new alliances emerge. Most educational, I believe, for anyone interested in the study of human nature. I found myself attracted to the idea. The summer had been unusually peaceful, and the prospect of spending a few days in the countryside, surrounded by the gentile society of a country wedding, appealed much. The estate itself is quite remarkable, I added, my excitement mounting. The house is from the Georgian period, but Sir James made extensive improvements when he purchased it, and the gardens, especially in June, are reputed to be among the best in the county. The house's south front is covered in a shower of purple, petals from the wisteria that inspired its name. Then it's settled and pronounced Poirot with remarkable finality. We will attend this wedding, and I will be able to watch the young lady who has captured your description powers, as well as the successful barista who has won her hand. As I wrote our acceptance letter that afternoon, I found myself looking forward to the voyage with true enthusiasm. The thought of witnessing Helena's joy at meeting her distinguished husband-to-be and renewing acquainted with the Mallory family struck me as a refreshing break from our normal London routine. My only minor concern stemmed from some half-remembered chats in my club in which Thornton's name was mentioned in connection with some fairly intricate international business activities that required careful treatment by the authorities. However, such issues appeared completely disconnected from the enjoyable social occasion that awaited us. As I sealed the envelope containing our gracious acceptance, I had no idea that this seemingly innocent social engagement would soon entangle us in circumstances that would put even Poirot's remarkable deduction skills to the test, and that the beautiful Wisteria House would become the setting for a mystery that would challenge our understanding of human nature. Chapter 2 covers arrivals and first impressions. The ride to Hampshire was as enjoyable as I had hoped, with the countryside presenting itself in the peculiar brilliance that characterizes the English summer at its most beneficent. Poirot, seated beside me in the railway compartment, examined the passing scenery with the same passion he brought to all human endeavors, as if each hedger and cottage could reveal something about the national character. His traveling attire was always excellent. Every detail, from his patent leather shoes to his precisely knotted tie, reflected the obsession with order that defined his approach to both personal presentation and criminal investigation. You notice, Hastings, as our train pulled into the local station, how the architecture of this region appeals to the English yearning for permanence and tradition. These buildings offer more than just provide shelter. They make remarks about their residents' social status. Indeed, as our rental car traveled through the tiny roads toward Wisteria House, I found myself musing on the validity of his comment. The cottages and manor houses we passed appeared to represent centuries of careful cultivation, with each generation adding its own refinements while retaining the underlying quality that distinguished this part of England as notably civilized. Wisteria House exceeded even my fondest memories. The Georgian facade rose before us with the precise symmetry that appealed to the architectural sensitivities of the time, while the beautiful wisteria vines that gave the home its name cascaded across the southern wall in a breathtaking display of purple blooms. The entrance drive curled through groomed gardens that spoke of both great expense and good taste, with specimen trees and meticulously maintained flower beds producing breathtaking panoramas. Monsieur, whispered Poirot as our vehicle came to a stop at the main door. One can immediately understand why such qualities elicit both adoration and perhaps less noble sentiments. Our reception was as welcoming as the June sunshine that enveloped the estate. Sir James Mallory, despite his elderly age, maintained the robust bearing that had undoubtedly contributed to his amazing rise from humble beginnings to his current position among the landed aristocracy. His handshake was solid, his demeanor was courteous without being effusive, and his obvious joy in our presence struck me as absolutely genuine. Captain Hastings, how delightful to see you again after all these years, he said, his voice retaining traces of the northern accent he had never completely abandoned, despite his social advancement. And this must be the great Monsieur Poirot, about whom we have heard such wonderful stories. Lady Mallory, a woman of around 55 years who had evidently once been quite beautiful, greeted us with the grace that distinguishes the competent hostess. Her meticulous attention to detail in the arrangements was evident throughout. From the immaculately appointed guest rooms, we were shown to the subtle coordination of floral displays throughout the public rooms. But it was Helena who drew my initial attention as we sat for tea on the balcony overlooking the grounds. The years had refined rather than lessened her beautiful beauty, and I was taken aback by the intensity of her black eyes as she greeted us to her family home. There was an aura of barely controlled excitement around her that appeared to go beyond typical bridal expectation, a character that suggested depths of feeling, or perhaps dread, that regular social language could not fully contain. "Captain Hastings," she replied, extending an elegant hand. "How nice of you to travel such a distance for my wedding." I confessed that I had wondered if our past friendship would be enough of an incentive. "My dear Miss Mallory, or should I say soon to be, Mrs. Thornton, the pleasure is all mine. Can I introduce my pal, Monsieur Poirot?" Poirot executed one of his distinctive formal bows. His demeanor conveyed both respect and a subtle assessment, which he brought to all new interactions. "Mademoiselle, I'm captivated. Your reputation for beauty precedes you, but in actuality, she exceeds all expectations." Helena's laugh sounded hesitant. "You are too nice, Monsieur Poirot. Yet I believe a gentleman with your extraordinary powers of observation sees far more than just superficial appearances." As the afternoon continued, I found myself listing the numerous wedding guests that had gathered for the occasion. Richard Thornton, the prospective bridegroom, turned out to be a pleasant young man of about 32 years old, with the easy confidence that distinguishes a successful barista. His history, Helena emphasized during our talk, was entirely respectable. The son of a county judge, educated at Winchester and Oxford, has chambers in Lincoln's Inn, and specializes in commercial law. Helena told me as we went through the Rose Garden that Richard and I met through mutual contacts in London's legal circles. I was impressed by his brilliance and expertise of international commerce. We discovered a mutual interest in the complexity of South American trade agreements. However, something about her demeanor implied undercurrents she couldn't quite describe, a trait that reminded me of her previous mysterious air. Hero, I saw, observed these tiny cues with his usual sensitivity to psychological complexity. The wedding party was made up of a combination of London legal society and local Hampshire aristocracy, producing the social ambiance that is typical of large country house events. Gerald Fenton, the bridegroom's best man, stood out quickly due to his cheery demeanor and obvious popularity among both parties. A man of about 35 years old with the hearty good humor that makes such people welcome in any company, he appeared to act as a natural bridge between the sometimes difficult differences of provincial and metropolis life. Richard said to me as we saw Gerald engage in an impassioned chat with numerous local dignitaries, "We've been pals since Oxford, albeit he's made more of an impression in business circles than I have in law. Quite the entrepreneur, having interests spanning South America and beyond." The evening's festivities finished with casual musical entertainment in the drawing room, with Helena demonstrating her tremendous proficiency on the pianoforte and several visitors contributing songs and recitations. Throughout the ceremonies, I saw Poirot's meticulous attention to the social dynamics unfolding before us. The subtle alliances and soft tensions that characterize any gathering were varied. Personalities come together for ceremonial reasons. As I retreated to my chamber that night, the sounds of the Hampshire countryside wafting through the open windows, I thought about the actual pleasure this social interlude promised to provide. The wedding preparations appeared to be running smoothly. The numerous participants appeared to be really fond of one another, and the location couldn't have been more wonderful. However, I couldn't shake a nagging feeling of worry that had begun to bother me, possibly due to Helena's demeanor or the unduly cautious manner in which some topics of conversation were skirted. When business matters emerged during the evening's discussions. Chapter 3. An Unpleasant Guest. The second day of our stay at Wisteria House began with that special brilliance that defines the best of English summer mornings. I had risen early, excited at the idea of visiting the estate's renowned gardens before the heat of the day made such activities less appealing. The vista from my chamber window across the neatly kept lawns to the distant hills was so picturesque that it was easy to forget the complexities and anxieties that characterize modern life. Poirot, I noticed as I descended to the breakfast room, had already finished his morning ablutions with the precise care that distinguished all of his personal habits. He sat at the mahogany table with his usual precision, eating a modest breakfast, and studying correspondence that had arrived with the Morning Post. "Ah, Hastings," he murmured as I entered. "You see the purity of this domestic arrangement. Everything it says about careful planning and attention to the smallest detail is highly instructive for those studying the human character. Indeed, the domestic settings reflected Lady Mallory's outstanding hostess skills. The servants moved quietly and efficiently. The table settings were impeccable, and the morning's food offered content and diversity without ostentation. However, beneath this calm veneer, I noticed undercurrents of apprehensive energy, indicating that the upcoming wedding was causing strains that were not immediately obvious to the casual spectator. Helena appeared shortly before 9 o'clock, her demeanor suggesting a restlessness that contrasted with the calm domestic setting. She wore a soft yellow muslin morning dress that matched her dark complexion well, yet her motions were almost frenetic as she rushed between the breakfast buffet and the French doors leading to the terrace. "I hope you slept well, gentlemen," she inquired, her attention divided between our comments and a private preoccupation that consumed the majority of her thoughts. "Most excellently, thank you," I said. "The country air, after the stuffiness of London, is astonishingly healing. I was just talking to Pro about the extraordinary beauty of your gardens this season. Yes, Father has always taken special interest in the grounds," Helena said, her gaze shifting periodically to the drive visible through the morning chrome windows. He sees the landscape as an extension of the house, with each feature strategically placed to generate the intended effect. The morning's peace was broken shortly before 11 a.m. by the unexpected appearance of an automobile whose occupant was completely unknown to the assembled group. Through the morning room windows, I noticed a portly middle-aged man struggling to get out of what appeared to be a leased vehicle. His appearance was acceptable but unremarkable, similar to that of a commercial traveler or modest professional in any provincial town. Helena's reaction to the arrival was instantaneous and intense. The color had drained from her face, and her hands trembled slightly as she set down her coffee cup. But it was Gerald Fenton's reaction that was most instructive. His typically cheery countenance transformed with something approaching fear as he recognized the visitor through the window. "Good Lord," Gerald mumbled under his breath. "What the devil is Bristow doing here? Do you know this gentleman?" Richard inquired, sensing his friend's obvious distress. "Arthur Bristow," Gerald responded grudgingly. "A business acquaintance from my South American enterprises who is very persistent in his commercial contacts." Helena arose hastily from the table. "Excuse me," she mumbled. "I believe I should greet our visitor." Through the open French doors, we could hear voices from the front terrace. Helena's sophisticated tones were intermingled with a harsher accent that rang through the morning air. As we approached the terrace, the stranger said to Miss Mallory, "You look remarkably well. Marriage clearly agrees with you even before the ceremony, though I must admit that I was surprised not to receive an invitation to this grand affair. Mr. Bristow," Helena's voice had a hint of barely controlled tension, "I am not sure what brings you to Hampshire, but you must understand that your presence is neither expected nor particularly welcome." The man she addressed as Bristow exuded the confidence that distinguishes some sorts of successful business people, those who have learnt to evaluate social circumstances primarily in terms of advantage and opportunity. His attire was well made, yet oddly improper for the environment, and his demeanor suggested a relationship with Helena that went way beyond casual acquaintance. "Come now, my dear," he said, his tone tinged with either threat or crass familiarity. "Surely former business associates deserve some regard, especially since they've traveled such a long way. Furthermore, I believe young Thornton and I may have some common interests in the import trade." Richard Thornton appeared at that moment, clearly summoned by the noise. His reaction to Bristow's presence was carefully controlled, but his legal background allowed him to anticipate potential issues that went beyond basic social embarrassment. "I am afraid there has been some misunderstanding," he said, his barrister's training showing in the careful modulation of his voice. "This is a private family gathering, and I don't recall issuing an invitation to Arthur Bristow, the interloper who left with obvious satisfaction." "And you're exactly right, young man. No formal invitation was extended. However, when one learns about former business associates' wedding plans, especially those involving partnerships in South American companies, one feels bound to send personal congrats." The conversation that followed was both illuminating and disturbing. Bristow's references to previous arrangements, combined with his pointed comments about maintaining discretion in commercial matters, created a tense atmosphere that seemed to pervade the entire gathering. Helena's responses became increasingly sharp, while Gerald Fenton appeared to be struggling with internal conflict, as evidenced by nervous glances between Bristow and the other wedding guests. Helena finally announced, her voice bearing an authority. "That brooked no disagreement. I believe it would be best if you left right away. Your presence here serves no useful purpose, and I must request that you respect my family's privacy on this important occasion." Bristow's smile contained no warmth. "Oh, I think I'll stay for the festivities, my dear. After all, weddings are such joyous occasions, and I have a special reason for wanting to witness this union. Furthermore, I am very curious about certain aspects of Mr. Thornton's legal practice. We may have more to discuss than you realize." The threat implicit in his words was unmistakable, though its precise nature remained unclear. Other wedding guests have begun to gather on the terrace, drawn by the evident drama unfolding before them. Richard's protective stance near Helena spoke eloquently of his concern, while Gerald's obvious distress suggested knowledge of circumstances that extended beyond the immediate confrontation. As Bristow was eventually shown to a guest chamber, Lady Mallory's breeding preventing any direct refusal of hospitality, however unwelcome, I found myself reflecting upon the sudden transformation that had overtaken our peaceful social gathering. The man's arrival had introduced elements of uncertainty and potential scandal that threatened to overshadow the approaching celebration entirely. Poirot, I observed, had witnessed these proceedings with that particular intensity he reserved for situations of genuine interest. As we retired to our chambers before luncheon, his only comment was characteristically cryptic. "Most instructive, mon ami. The past, it has a way of intruding upon the present, often at the most inconvenient moments. And this, Mr. Bristow, he carries with him the smell of secrets that others would prefer to keep buried." The remainder of the day passed in an atmosphere of forced normalcy, though the undercurrents of tension created by Bristow's presence were evident to anyone possessed of even moderate powers of observation. Chapter 4. The Wedding Day. The morning of the wedding began with that strange mix of promise and uncertainty that seemed to characterize our entire stay at Wisteria House. The weather had thankfully cleared from the previous evening's little shower, revealing a sky of such crystalline purity that it could have been ordered just for the event. However, beneath this meteorological blessing lay currents of tension that no amount of sunshine could completely alleviate. As was common for such occasions, The male visitors were encouraged to partake in a traditional hunt around the estate's expansive grounds. Having maintained an interest in equestrian hobbies despite the passage of time, I found myself eagerly anticipating this morning's diversion. The notion of riding through the Hampshire countryside on horseback, especially in such illustrious company, struck me as a fitting precursor to the wedding ceremony itself. Pujo, predictably, declined to participate in these proceedings. Mon ami remarked that the chase of innocent creatures for sport does not appeal to the Belgian nature, as evidenced by the small smile that frequently accompanied his more philosophical statements. Furthermore, I believe that the domestic preparations for such an event reveal far more about human character than any display of horsemanship. The hunting party gathered shortly after 8 o'clock, consisting of around a dozen gentlemen with varied levels of passion and expertise. Richard Thornton, despite his obvious preoccupation with the upcoming event, displayed exceptional civility as host, ensuring that rides were appropriately assigned and that less experienced riders received sufficient coaching. His demeanor throughout these preparations struck me as that of a man committed to meet societal commitments, despite significant personal distraction. Gerald Fenton proved to be an accomplished horseman, with his cheerful demeanor extending to helpful advice on the estate's terrain and the likely behavior of the local foxes. As we gathered in the stable yard, he commented that the country was ideal for hunting. Sir James has done a wonderful job of maintaining the original boundaries, and the coverts give excellent sport. Arthur Bristow's presence at the party created an undercurrent of unease that no amount of sporting camaraderie could fully overcome. His horsemanship was passable rather than attractive, and his riding outfit, while functional, lacked the modest refinement that distinguished the dress of gentlemen born for such pastimes. More importantly, his attempts at conversation were welcomed with courteous, but noticeably chilly reactions from the other participants. "Fine morning for outdoor exercise," he said, to no one in particular, as we prepared to leave. "Nothing beats a nice gallop to whet the stomach for celebration." The hunt itself went reasonably well. However, I noticed Gerald Fenton's particular concern for his mount's care, particularly the quality of his riding boots, which he scrutinized with remarkable interest before mounting. The morning proved more tough than expected, with several difficult jumps and a particularly muddy passage through the lower meadows that put both horsemanship and equipment to the test. By 10 o'clock, menacing clouds had begun to form with the suddenness that is typical of June weather. What began as a light mist gradually turned into a persistent drizzle, then a downpour, making the beautifully maintained trails increasingly perilous for both horses and riders. As the rain fell harder, Richard announced, "We'd better get back inside. The last thing I need is for anyone to get injured on my wedding day." The retreat to Wisteria House came just in time, as the heavens opened with the unexpected ferocity that summer thunderstorms are known for. Our group arrived in the stable yard soaking saturated, our boots caked in muck, and the grooming from the previous morning completely undone. The juxtaposition between our disheveled look and the pristine preparations apparent throughout the home generated an almost comedic incongruity. "Gentlemen, I urge you pay immediate care to your toilet," Sir James advised with the practical wisdom of someone who has spent a lifetime in the countryside. "The ceremony begins in exactly 1 hour, and I doubt that our current appearance will add to the occasion's dignity." The accompanying rush to chambers, baths, and new clothes resulted in a flurry of domestic activity that momentarily concealed the underlying tensions of Bristow's arrival. Servants shuttled between chambers with hot water, clean bedding, and hastily pressed clothing, while the gentlemen negotiated the delicate task of changing muddy horses into wedding guests in 60 minutes. My own preparations went easily, but I admit to being concerned about the status of my morning clothes after being exposed to the outdoors. Poirot discovered in our sitting room, browsing a volume of local history, examined my untidy condition with clear delight. He noted that the English passion for outdoor sports provides the most interesting contrasts. One moment a rustic gentleman after the fox, the next a polished society visitor preparing for sacred ceremony. Most revealing in terms of social adaptability was the wedding ceremony itself, which proceeded with a beauty and somnolence that temporarily removed any concerns of morning hassles or unwanted guests. Helena, resplendent in silk and ancestral lace, glided through the liturgy with grace that drew unanimous adoration. The local church, decked with flowers from the estate's gardens, offered a backdrop of such exquisite classic elegance that it may have been commissioned particularly for artistic purposes. Richard's responses were clear and confident throughout the ceremony. However, I could sense a hint of stress in his demeanor, which is common among even the most willing bridegrooms on such occasions. The priest, an elderly gentleman who had clearly known the Mallory family for decades, led the service with dignity that matched both the attendees and the historical significance of the occasion. Even Bristow, who was positioned awkwardly in the assembly, maintained proper decorum throughout the ceremony. His presence, while still undesired, appeared to be temporarily mitigated by the spiritual nature of the occasion and the weight of tradition that accompanies such rites. The shift from church to reception gave opportunity for the sort of informal discourse that often proved most illuminating of social dynamics. As visitors went between the drawing rooms and out onto the terrace, I noticed the precise choreography that distinguishes effective entertaining among the English elite. Lady Mallory's arrangements were perfect. From the placement of refreshment tables to the subtle coaching that enabled proper circulation among varied social groups, the early afternoon's festivities gained momentum as champagne and wedding cake produced the mood of lifted spirits that characterizes the best celebrations. Dancing began in the main drawing room, while smaller groups gathered on the terrace to enjoy the clear weather and breathtaking views of the estate's grounds. Helena and Richard moved among their guests with apparent joy, their initial conflicts seemingly melted in the pleasure of the moment. However, throughout these procedures, I was aware of certain undercurrents that hinted that not everything was perfectly harmonic behind the surface gaiety. Bristow's attempts to engage other guests in conversation were met with variable degrees of success, and his specific focus on business things appeared to cause uneasiness among those he addressed. Gerald Fenton, in particular, looked to keep a respectful distance from the unpleasant visitor, albeit his innate civility precluded any visible offense. As the celebration reached its pinnacle of excitement and the newlywed couple prepared to cut the ceremonial cake, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary events that had changed this basic social gathering into something far more intricate and mysterious than anybody could have predicted. Chapter 5: Death at the Library. The change from jubilation to sorrow occurred with the suddenness that characterized the most dramatic shocks in human history. We were one moment immersed in the pleasant rituals of wedding celebration, such as the delicate murmur of conversation, the tinkling of crystal, and the muted laughing that accompany such elegant gatherings, and the next, our world had been irreversibly changed by the revelation, which would throw a shadow over all future occurrences. Following the morning's meteorological hiccups, the afternoon moved along admirably smoothly. The reception had struck the ideal blend of formality and warmth that distinguishes the most successful social gatherings, with attendees easily moving between the different reception rooms and the terrace facing the gardens. Helena and Richard strolled through the crowd with obvious delight, their joy serving as a focal point around which the entire celebration appeared to revolve. Arthur Bristow's absence from the festivities became apparent around 3 o'clock when the wedding cake was cut. Lady Mallory, with her meticulous attention to detail that distinguished her as an experienced hostess, became increasingly concerned as he disappeared from the company. Captain Hastings. She approached me cautiously as the cake ceremony ended. "I'm wondering if I may take advantage of your kindness for a small favor. Mr. Bristow looks to have left the party." and I'm anxious about his location. Would you be so kind as to conduct a discreet inquiry? I'd hate for any visitor to feel ignored on such a significant day." Her request, while phrased with characteristic diplomatic delicacy, hinted that she shared the general relief at Bristow's absence from the immediate festivities. Nonetheless, the requirements of hospitality required that some care be paid to his well-being, no matter how unpleasant his stay may have been. "Of course, Lady Mallory," I said, "I will be delighted to assist." My hunt for the missing guest began in the obvious places: the smoking room, the billiard room, and the many smaller reception areas where a gentleman may seek privacy or thought. Finding no evidence of him in these clear refutations, I broadened my search to include the morning room and eventually the library, that beautiful chamber packed with leather-bound volumes that served as Sir James' private sanctuary when he wasn't entertaining visitors. It was in this temple of literature and learning that I made the discovery that would transform our pleasant social gathering into something far more sinister and complicated. The scene that unfolded as I opened the thick wood door is seared in my memory with the clarity reserved for moments of extreme shock. Arthur Bristow sat slumped in one of the leather reading seats near the huge mullioned windows, which supplied natural light for scholastic activities. His position was that of a man who had simply fallen asleep while reading, which is not uncommon in such pleasant surroundings. However, the extreme stillness of his shape quickly suggested a more permanent state. My initial approach was cautious, driven by an instinctual reluctance to interrupt what could be a lovely sleep. However, when I got closer, the reality of the scenario became horrifyingly clear. A dark stain had developed across the right side of Bristow's skull, and his clothing revealed unambiguous indications of violence that no amount of charitable interpretation could explain. On the floor next the chair was a service revolver, the type one was familiar with from my military duty. A sheet of paper beside Bristow's left hand appeared to have writing on it in his trademark cramped style, but my initial reaction stopped me from inspecting its contents. The finding that followed my hurried summoning brought the family's meticulously planned celebration to a sudden and frightening end. Sir James arrived first, his expression solemn as he contemplated the ramifications of the picture before us. Lady Mallory's composure, despite being strained by the circumstances, remained impressively intact as she skillfully organized the practical needs of such an emergency. Sir James announced, with the authority of someone used to crisis management, that we needed to call the police right away, and I'm afraid the festivities must be halted until this problem is thoroughly investigated. The local constabulary arrived quickly, commanded by Inspector Meadows, a steadfast gentleman whose experience with rural crime had clearly not prepared him for such dramatic circumstances. His initial investigation of the area was meticulous, but I noticed a sense of enjoyment in his demeanor that distinguishes officials confronted with seemingly obvious conclusions. He announced suicide after completing his preliminary investigation. The weapon, the setting, and this note all indicate a clear instance of self-destruction. Of course, the timing is awful, but these commercial types frequently carry weights that casual onlookers are unaware of. When analyzed, the note appeared to substantiate the inspector's findings. Written in Bristow's hand, it mentioned intolerable financial strains and unattainable duties, implying that he was forced to desperate actions by circumstances beyond his control. The language was one of true sorrow, albeit something about the phrasing struck me as slightly theatrical, too skillfully crafted, perhaps for a man on the verge of self-destruction. Helena's reaction to these occurrences was instantaneous and powerful. The news of Bristow's death appeared to touch her more deeply than mere shock, which an unforeseen tragedy could account for, and her responses to the inspector's regular questions revealed an uneasiness that went beyond normal social discomfort in such circumstances. Mrs. Thornton, Inspector Meadows, addressed her with the appropriate social civility. "I understand you had a previous acquaintance with the deceased. May I query as to the nature of your relationship?" Helena's hesitation to answer was brief but apparent. "My family knew Mr. Bristow through business. I hadn't seen him in several years until his unexpected appearance yesterday. And your conversation with him last morning. Several witnesses reported what looked to be a heated exchange. Could you please explain the essence of that discussion?" The color that rose in Helena's cheeks was obvious to everyone present. He held certain misunderstandings regarding old family business problems. I simply tried to explain why such issues were no longer relevant. Inspector Meadows took detailed notes on these comments, while his demeanor indicated increased interest rather than satisfied satisfaction. The timing of Bristow's death, which occurred at the wedding reception and so soon after the public disagreement, raised questions that even the most generous interpretation could not fully discount. Richard Thornton's support for his new wife was instant and unconditional, yet I detected in his legal background a recognition of the possible issues these circumstances could cause. His responses to the inspector's inquiries were accurate and helpful, but they also possessed the meticulous quality that distinguishes persons who grasp the necessity of exact language in official processes. Poirot, who had seen these proceedings, with his customary attention to detail, approached me as the inspector finished his initial investigation. His demeanor implied thoughts that went much beyond the obvious findings reached by the official probe. "Most interesting," Monamy whispered, his keen eyes scanning the library with careful precision. "The scene tells a tale, but it may not be the one that our excellent inspector thinks it does." As the wedding guests left in subdued confusion and the family went into the grim business of dealing with an unexpected death, I found myself musing on the extraordinary turnaround that had occurred in just a few hours. What had started out as a celebration of love and new beginnings had evolved into something more darker and more convoluted. A problem that would put Pugh's famed deduction skills to the test before finally being solved. Chapter 6. Under Suspicion. The strange circumstances surrounding Arthur Bristow's death had begun to weave themselves into a web of suspicion, threatening to entangle everyone who had witnessed the previous day's tragic events. As a retired military officer with extensive experience studying human behavior under stress, I found myself in a unique position to watch the subtle changes that occur when routine social events become the target of criminal investigations. The morning after the tragedy was dreary and dismal, as if the entire atmosphere of Wisteria House had absorbed some of the shade produced by Bristow's death. Inspector Meadows had set up his temporary headquarters in Sir James' study, changing it from a literary haven into an examination room where each member of the household and wedding party would be subjected to the rigorous scrutiny of official investigation. Helena bore the weight of this attention with poise that reflected well on her breeding. However, beneath her carefully maintained exterior, I detected the strain of someone whose every word and gesture had the potential to be legally significant. Her position as the deceased's most visible adversary imposed a cloud of suspicion that no amount of social standing could completely remove. "Mrs. Thornton," Inspector Meadows addressed her at what I believe was their second formal interview. "I must ask that you reconsider your previous statements about your relationship with the deceased. Our investigations have discovered that Mr. Bristow had comprehensive knowledge of various family financial arrangements, implying a more significant acquaintance than you initially claimed." Helena's carefully controlled response revealed the emotional cost of these repeated interrogations. "Inspector, I have been completely truthful in my statements. Mr. Bristow was involved in some financial dealings with my late uncle's estate a few years back. His claims of continued importance to our family affairs were completely unfounded. The discovery of a family tie through her deceased uncle was the first significant hint to Helena's genuine relationship with Bristow. Her uncle, as I discovered through discreet inquiries, had been involved in South American trade before his untimely death in Buenos Aires 3 years prior, leaving some unresolved business complications. Nonetheless, even as she spoke these words with admirable conviction, I noticed a slight tremor in her hands, indicating levels of anxiety that were not immediately apparent to casual observers. My own military experience had taught me to detect the symptoms of nervous strain, and Helena's behavior reflected all of the hallmarks of someone working under stresses that went beyond simple sadness after an unexpected death. Richard Thornton's support for his bride remained unwavering, despite his legal training, which had clearly identified the potential gravity of their situation. During his own interview with the inspector, he demonstrated the careful precision of language that distinguishes an accomplished barrister. However, I noticed undertones of anxiety that indicated understanding of events outside his professional control. My wife's distress at Mr. Bristow's intrusion was completely understandable, he said with measured emphasis. The man's behavior was presumptuous and inappropriate for the occasion. However, claiming that this justifies suspicion of involvement in his death strikes me as a particularly dangerous leap of logic. Inspector Meadows, on the other hand, did not appear to be convinced by these claims of innocence. His investigation had begun to focus more intensely on the timing of events, the possibility of private conversation with the deceased, and the apparent contradiction between Helena's claimed limited knowledge of Bristow's affairs and the intimacy implied by their public confrontation. The facts, as I understand them from the inspector's conversation with Sir James, point to a young woman with both motive and opportunity. The deceased clearly had knowledge of her family's business dealings, which caused her significant distress, and his death occurred at a time when she could have acted without being detected. This official line of reasoning created an atmosphere of rising tension throughout the household, which no amount of politeness could completely conceal. The servants moved about their duties with that particular consciousness of crisis which marks domestic establishments under external scrutiny, while the remaining wedding guests found themselves trapped between social obligation and personal unease at their unexpected involvement in criminal proceedings. Poirot's response to these developments differed markedly from the inspector's methodical but conventional approach. Rather than focusing primarily upon the obvious suspect, my friend had begun that characteristic process of detailed observation and seemingly casual inquiry, which preceded his most brilliant deductive achievements. I discovered him on the morning of the second day, examining the library with that meticulous attention to detail which marked his investigative method. His interest appeared to center not upon the chair where Bristow's body had been discovered, but rather upon the carpet and furnishings in the immediate vicinity, particularly near the windows where the morning light provided optimal illumination. "You observe something significant, Poirot?" I inquired, noting his particular attention to a section of polished floor near the reading table. Perhaps mon ami, the eye, it sees many things, but the trained mind, it must distinguish between the significant and the merely coincidental. Tell me, Hastings, what impressions did you form of the hunting party's return yesterday morning? This seemingly tangential inquiry struck me as typical of Poirot's approach to complex problems, the usual mixture of enthusiasm and incompetence that marked such gatherings. The weather proved unfortunate naturally, and we returned considerably the worse for wear. Ah yes, the weather most inconvenient for outdoor pursuits, but perhaps illuminating in other respects. You recall the condition of the participants upon your return. Thoroughly soaked and muddy, I'm afraid. The stable yard resembled a battlefield after our retreat from the elements. We all required immediate attention to our dress and personal grooming. Poirot nodded with evident satisfaction. Princey and the boots. Hastings, you observed the condition of the footwear following this morning's adventure. His question seemed to possess significance that extended beyond mere curiosity about hunting attire, though I confess myself unable to penetrate his reasoning. Much as one would expect after traversing muddy terrain in a downpour. Nothing remarkable in that, surely. Perhaps not remarkable, but potentially most instructive. The details, Moni, always it is the details that illuminate the truth. Throughout this period of official investigation and private inquiry, I maintained careful observation of the various personalities involved in our increasingly complex situation. Gerald Fenton, the bridegroom's best man, displayed that particular combination of helpful cooperation and underlying nervousness which often marks those caught between loyalty to friends and respect for legal authority. His responses to Inspector Meadows's questions were forthright and apparently complete, yet I detected occasional hesitations that suggested thoughts he chose not to express. Bristow struck me as a rather unpleasant fellow, he admitted during one conversation. The sort who enjoys creating discomfort for others through implications of knowledge he may or may not actually possess. Not the type one would ordinarily welcome at such a celebration. His assessment of the deceased aligned with my own observations. Yet something in his manner suggested reservations about aspects of the situation that he deemed inappropriate for public discussion. The complex dynamics of loyalty and suspicion that mark any group subjected to criminal investigation had begun to manifest themselves among our small company with increasing clarity. As the investigation proceeded and Inspector Meadows's suspicions regarding Helena's involvement became increasingly apparent, I found myself reflecting upon the remarkable transformation that had occurred within our small social circle. What had begun as a celebration of new beginnings had evolved into a test of character and loyalty that would leave permanent marks upon all involved, regardless of the ultimate resolution of Bristow's mysterious demise. Chapter 7. The Little Gray. Cells at work. The strange developments at Wisteria House had begun to take on the character that distinguishes the most perplexing criminal investigations. Obvious conclusions prove increasingly unsatisfactory under close examination, while seemingly insignificant details gain unexpected importance. As a former military commander with extensive experience studying human nature in difficult situations, I found myself sucked into the complicated web of suspicion and counter-suspicion that now engulfed our conventionally pleasant social gathering. Poirot's response to the escalating problem was markedly different from Inspector Meadow's thorough but conventional probe. Whereas the official investigation focused on motive and opportunity in their most evident expressions, my friend had begun the typical process of meticulous observation and psychological analysis that would lead to his most impressive deductive successes. His behavior during the third morning following Bristow's death showed thoughts that ran much beyond the seeming simplicity of suicide or the inspector's developing conviction regarding Helena's guilt. I found him in the library shortly after breakfast, inspecting the scene of the tragedy with the thorough attention to detail that distinguished his investigation style. His attention appeared to be drawn to aspects of the room that had escaped official notice, such as the precise placement of furniture, the arrangement of books on nearby shelves, and most notably, the condition of the polished floor near where Bristow's body had been discovered. "Hastings, mon ami," he remarked as he continued to examine the carpet near the windows. "Approach, if you like, and tell me what observations you make about this specific place." I agreed with his request, though I must admit that I was first unable to notice anything extraordinary about the portion of flooring that drew his attention. The library's Persian carpet, of great quality and substantial age, had the unavoidable indications of regular usage, while the polished wood, evident at its edges, represented the careful upkeep characteristic of well-run houses. "I'm afraid I don't see anything really remarkable, Poirot. The typical wear patterns seen in earlier gentlemen's libraries. There's nothing more." "Ah, but please look more attentively. Here, at the leg of this reading table, you can see a small discoloration." Following his instructions, I saw what looked to be a little discoloration of the wood, roughly circular in shape and possibly, too, in diameter. The mark was barely visible, the type of little flaw that could easily go unnoticed by ordinary observers, but would be important to experienced eyes. "Yes, I see now. I believe there is some sort of taint. Water damage or not water. Mon ami, or look at the pattern, the definite outline. This marking tells Poirot a lot about what happened here. His eyes, those extraordinary green orbs that seemed to comprehend every secret, had that distinct glimmer that indicated highly complicated thoughts. Tell me, Hastings, what you noticed about the deceased's handwriting when you examined his documents yesterday. This seeming digression struck me as typical of Poirot's approach, though I struggled to see the connection between Bristow's calligraphy and the library's flooring. His script was cramped but distinctive. As previously stated, the suicide letter bore all of the features of his regular writing, but Inspector Meadows had it inspected by an expert to ensure authenticity. Ah, yes, the expert examination. What conclusion did this professional reach? That the note was really written by Bristow himself. However, the expert saw some irregularities in letter construction that suggested the writer was under a lot of emotional stress. Poirot nodded seriously, possibly copying from another sample of his own handwriting. Tell me, mon ami, what our departing friend brought with him in terms of communication or personal papers. I considered the inventory of Bristow's belongings that Inspector Meadows had compiled. Several business letters, a leather portfolio holding various commercial documents, and what looked to be a model contract for import arrangements, all of which were typical of a guy interested in international trade. Most interestingly, this document bears his signature naturally. Indeed, several signatures, as such documents frequently require multiple authorizations and amendments. I hesitated, beginning to see the direction of Poirot's thoughts. You speculate that someone may have used these signatures as models to forge the suicide note. The possibility exists, mon ami, but let us return to this mark upon the floor. Consider the nature of this stain and its shape. It is unusual, spherical, with slightly uneven edges and fits the circumstances of the morning hunt. What conclusions may one draw? I inspected the mark more thoroughly, applying what knowledge I had gained from my years of service about the many substances that could cause such impressions. It appears to be the type of mark made by the sole of a boot. I believe a wet boot, pressed strongly against the wood and remained there for some time. Precissimo, the boot print left by someone whose footwear retained a lot of moisture. Now, mon ami, consider the importance of this revelation. The efficient workers cleaned and polished the library floors before to the wedding ceremony. This mark was created when the preparations were completed. The significance of his observation began to register on me with increasing clarity. You intend to imply that someone wearing wet boots from the hunt entered this room after the floors had been cleaned, but before they had time to fully dry their gear, not only visited Hastings, but also stood precisely here near the chair where poor Bristow was later located. The positioning is really educational. Someone stood still at this area for sufficient time to create such a strong impression. As Poirot's argument grew clearer, I found myself questioning the entire chain of events that led to Bristow's killing. The official theory of suicide, already strained by inconsistencies in timing and behavior, became increasingly difficult to defend in light of this new evidence. But surely, I argued, the presence of wet boot prints just suggests that someone sought refuge in the library during the storm. There's nothing intrinsically nefarious about that. Ah, mon ami, but you overlook the critical aspect of timing. The hunt returned at 10:30 a.m. The wedding ceremony began at 11:30. The reception started at 1 o'clock. And the body was discovered at 3:15. For a boot print to remain moist enough to leave such a trace, the user would need to have entered this chamber within around 30 minutes of returning from the hunt. The gravity of this deduction struck me with great intensity. If Poirot's thinking is true, someone who took part in the hunt entered the library with damp boots at a time when they should have been getting ready for the wedding ceremony. Furthermore, Poirot continued, his voice taking on the quality that distinguished his most important revelations, Consider the nature of the hunting party itself, who participated, and more importantly, who possessed both the knowledge and the means to arrange poor Bristow's apparent suicide. I found myself paying closer attention to the members of that morning's expedition. Richard, Gerald, numerous local gentlemen, Bristow himself, and others were among the participants, and their actions throughout the critical period would have to be closely scrutinized. Poirot noted that the placement of this bootprint shows that someone stood here for some minutes, marking the exact location when the mark appeared. Not just passing by, but remaining still, possibly engaged in a thoughtful activity that required close attention to detail. As these information piled, I began to see the framework of a considerably more sophisticated and sinister scenario than either the suicide theory or Inspector Meadows' concerns about Helena suggested. The careful attention to timing, understanding of household habits, and purposeful nature of the evidence all indicated sophisticated premeditation. Poirot's discovery had far-reaching ramifications beyond the immediate circumstances of Bristow's killing, implying depths of intrigue and skillfully veiled relationships that altered our perspective of the scenario as a whole. As I focused on the numerous personalities we had met during our stay at Wisteria House, I found myself questioning each person's actions and remarks in light of these alarming new possibilities. Chapter 8, The Revelation. The end of our extraordinary stay at Wisteria House came with that sense of inescapable conclusion that marks the resolution of the most perplexing human dramas. As a retired military officer with extensive experience in crisis and revelation, I had witnessed numerous instances where hidden truths surfaced to transform our understanding of events. Few occasions, however, had prepared me for Poirot's masterful demonstration of deductive reasoning for our assembled company. The gathering in the library on that final evening had all of the theatrical elements that my friend cherished. Inspector Meadows, though hesitant to indulge in what he clearly considered continental eccentricity, had agreed to Poirot's request that all parties to our mystery gather in the same room where Arthur Bristow had met his untimely death. The symbolism was not lost on any of us, and I noticed in the various expressions that mixture of apprehension and curiosity that distinguishes those who believe they are about to witness something significant. Helena and Richard sat in chairs near the fireplace, their newlywed status providing a natural unity against the suspicions that had clouded their brief marriage. Sir James and Lady Mallory maintained their characteristic dignity in the face of recent events, while Gerald Fenton stood apart from the others, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by something approaching weariness. Inspector Meadows had arranged himself at the desk, notebook in hand, ready to record any revelations that might emerge from these unusual proceedings. Madame Zessio, Poirot began, his voice carrying that distinct authority that had commanded attention in drawing rooms throughout Europe. We've gathered tonight to discuss a tragedy that has turned celebration into mourning, joy into suspicion, and apparent simplicity into complex deception. His opening words established the gravity of the situation while retaining the dramatic flair that defined his approach to revelation. I paid close attention to the faces before us, noting the subtle variations in expression that indicated each person's unique relationship to the unfolding drama. Poirot went on to say that Arthur Bristow's death appeared to be suicide at first, a conclusion supported by physical evidence and seemingly confirmed by the deceased's written confession. Yet from the beginning certain elements troubled the logical mind: the positioning of the weapon, the nature of the farewell note, and most significantly the psychology of the victim himself suggested a different interpretation of events. Inspector Meadows shifted somewhat impatiently in his chair. "Mon Poirot, while I appreciate your analytical approach, the physical evidence clearly points to Mrs. Thornton, motivated by her family's past business entanglements with the deceased." "Ah, but there you make the fundamental error, mon ami. You observe the surface manifestations without penetrating to the deeper truths that explain them. The connection between Mrs. Thornton and the unfortunate Bristow was indeed significant, but not in the manner you suppose. Helena's color heightened at these words, though whether from relief or continued anxiety remained unclear. Richard's protective gesture toward his wife spoke eloquently of his unwavering support, despite the mounting pressures of official suspicion. The key to understanding this tragedy, Poirot explained with growing intensity, lies not in old family business matters, but in current commercial arrangements that threaten to destroy both reputation and freedom. Arthur Bristow possessed evidence of systematic embezzlement from a thriving import business with extensive South American connections. He paused dramatically, his keen eyes surveying the assembled faces with that penetrating intensity which seemed to read the very thoughts of those before him. Bristow had discovered that his business partner was systematically diverting funds from their joint ventures, using his position to cover substantial gambling debts that threatened financial ruin. Gerald Fenton's reaction to these words was immediate and profound. The color drained from his face, while his hands, I observed, trembled slightly as he gripped the arms of his chair. The transformation from genial wedding guest to cornered criminal was remarkable in its completeness. The morning hunt, Poirot continued relentlessly, provided the perfect opportunity for private conversation between blackmailer and victim. The return journey, as the party struggled with deteriorating weather conditions, Mr. Fenton arranged to meet Bristow privately in the library immediately following the wedding ceremony. "This is preposterous," Gerald protested, though his voice lacked the conviction necessary to carry persuasion. "I barely knew Bristow beyond casual business acquaintance." "On the contrary, mon ami, your acquaintance was both intimate and profitable until Bristow's investigations threatened to expose your systematic theft from the import business you operated jointly with other partners. The funds diverted to cover your gambling obligations were substantial, and discovery would have meant not merely financial ruin, but criminal prosecution." The revelation of Gerald's financial desperation transformed our understanding of the entire situation. What had appeared to be random coincidence now revealed itself as careful planning, while the apparent spontaneity of the crime dissolved under scrutiny of its methodical execution. The murder itself was carefully planned, Poirot explained, his voice taking on that particular quality which marked his most impressive deductions. During the hunt's early return, Mr. Fenton deliberately preserved the moisture in his riding boots by concealing them in the stable tackroom, rather than allowing them to dry properly. After quickly changing his outer garments for the ceremony, he retained these damp boots for his planned meeting with Bristow. The physical evidence that had so puzzled our initial investigation now assumed its proper significance. The wet boot print that Poirot had discovered near Bristow's chair provided irrefutable proof of the murderer's presence at the crucial moment, while the timing eliminated all other members of the hunting party who had properly attended to their grooming. The suicide note, Poirot continued inexorably, was prepared using samples of Bristow's handwriting found among the commercial correspondence he carried. The killer had ample opportunity to study these documents during their business relationship, enabling him to create a convincing forgery when the need arose. The shooting itself was accomplished with cold calculation, he explained further. The weapon, Mr. Fenton's service revolver from the war, was positioned to suggest self-destruction, while the prepared note was placed beside the body. The timing, during the height of wedding festivities, ensured that the crime would not be discovered until the murderer had ample opportunity to establish his alibi among the celebrating guests. Gerald's composure finally collapsed under this methodical exposition of his guilt. The jovial best man, the loyal friend, the popular guest, all revealed themselves as elaborate masks concealing the calculating mind of a desperate criminal. His confession, when it came, possessed that quality of relief which marks those who can no longer sustain the burden of deception. Helena's quarrel with Bristow, Poirot concluded, concerned her late uncle's estate, in which Bristow had discovered certain irregularities years earlier. Her distress stemmed from fear that these old scandals might emerge to taint her wedding day, not from any involvement in current crimes. Inspector Meadows, his notebook, recording every detail of this extraordinary revelation, gradually assumed control of the situation with the efficient authority of official duty. The transformation of social gathering into criminal proceeding proceeded with that inexorable quality which marks the triumph of justice over deception. As the evening concluded and Gerald Fenton was led away to face the consequences of his actions, I found myself reflecting upon the remarkable demonstration of analytical genius I had witnessed. Poirot's ability to penetrate beyond obvious appearances to hidden truths had once again vindicated his confidence in the power of pure reason to illuminate even the most carefully concealed mysteries. The shadow that had threatened to destroy Helena and Richard's future happiness had been lifted through the application of those little gray cells, which my friend so frequently invoked as his primary investigative weapon. Epilogue. The train to London carried us away from Hampshire 3 days after Gerald Fenton's arrest. The countryside passing in a gentle blur of green fields and cottage gardens that seemed to mock the dark events we had witnessed. I found myself reflecting as the wheels clicked rhythmically along the tracks upon the extraordinary transformation that had occurred at what should have been a celebration of love and new beginnings. Poirot sat opposite me in our compartment, immaculate as always, despite our recent trials, his green eyes contemplating the landscape with that peculiar intensity he brought to all observations. The events at Wisteria House had affected him more than he cared to admit, for beneath his vanity and theatrical manner lay a genuine compassion for human suffering that made such revelations of betrayal particularly painful. "It is curious, Magnier," he remarked, breaking the comfortable silence between us, "how the seeds of tragedy are so often sown by the very qualities we most admire in human nature. Loyalty, friendship, the desire to protect those we care about. In Gerald Fenton, these virtues became the instruments of his destruction." I nodded, understanding his meaning. Gerald's fondness for gambling had been present since his Oxford days, a harmless indulgence at first, but when coupled with his access to business funds and his determination to remain Richard's trusted friend, it had created a spiral of deception that could only end in disaster. Even the detail of his deliberately kept wet boots, so small yet so damning, spoke of a man who thought he could outwit both circumstance and conscience. Helena and Richard had departed Wisteria House the morning after the revelation, their honeymoon postponed, but their union strengthened by the ordeal they had shared. Helena's relief at the removal of suspicion had been profound. Yet I detected in her manner a sadness for the friend whose betrayal had so nearly destroyed her happiness. The knowledge that Gerald's crimes had stemmed from desperation rather than malice seemed to weigh upon her generous spirit. "And what of the Mallory family?" I inquired. "Will they recover from this scandal?" "Ah, the English upper classes. They possess a remarkable resilience in such matters," Poirot replied with a slight smile. "Sir James has already begun the process of restoring his family's reputation through charitable works and discreet philanthropy. Lady Mallory's skills as a hostess will ensure that Wisteria House continues to welcome distinguished guests. In time, this tragedy will become merely another chapter in the house's long history." As London's outskirts began to appear through our carriage windows, I found myself grateful for the return to familiar surroundings. Yet I could not dismiss entirely the memory of purple wisteria cascading across Geoghegan Stone, or the image of that elegant library where friendship had been betrayed and justice ultimately served. "The little gray cells, Hastings," Poirot observed, noting my contemplative mood. "They serve not merely to solve mysteries, but to understand the complexities of the human heart. In this case, they revealed that the greatest crimes often spring not from evil, but from the failure to face one's own weaknesses with courage and honesty." The train pulled into Victoria Station with a great hiss of steam and grinding of brakes, returning us to the bustling anonymity of London life. Yet, as we gathered our belongings and prepared to resume our ordinary existence, I reflected that the events at Wisteria House had reminded us once again that beneath the veneer of civilization, human nature remains as complex and unpredictable as ever, a truth that would continue to provide ample material for Hercule Poirot's remarkable detective abilities. Thanks for joining us for the Wisteria House mystery. We hope this tale of secrets, suspicion, and betrayal kept you guessing until the very end. If you enjoyed unraveling this mystery, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Crimson Clues for more classic detective tales. Until our next mystery unfolds, this is Peter signing off from Crimson Clues.